Hello and welcome to the latest in the series of the Earn, Learn, Thrive LinkedIn Lives. And with me this afternoon, I have Peter Fulliger. Peter and I think, have known each other about 3 years since we met at an ELT Publishing Away Day. Yeah. And particularly in this month of Pride, I thought this would be a good topic for us to talk about. So why representation matters in ELT, and particularly looking at LGBTQIA plus representation. So let's start off then by kind of maybe trying to start answering that question. It's quite a big question. So I'm sure, we probably won't be able to cover everything, but what would be your answer to that question?
Yes, representation. Why does it matter? When I think about representation, I think about the one quotation from Marion Wright Edelman, who said, "You can't be what you can't see." Mm-hmm. And this resonated particularly with me, especially when I was growing up. I grew up in Section 28. And if people don't know, Section 28 was a law that was passed in the UK by Margaret Thatcher from 1988 until 2003, where schools in the UK were prohibited from talking about, or even, well, they say promoting LGBT identities as a pretended family relationship. And that was the actual quote from the law itself. And so for me, growing up without any kind of role model, without any kind of information saying it's actually okay to feel how you feel, it's okay to be this particular identity. And so I grew up with that, and then into early adulthood, it really affected me quite negatively. So representation really does matter. And there's this new report that's been brought out by Just Like Us. It was published on the 1st of June to coincide with Pride Month. It's called Positive Futures. And in that report, they say that schools that are unsupportive in terms of LGBT identities create worse future outcomes for all pupils, but especially LGBT plus pupils, even affecting their optimism for the future, their kind of enjoyment of their career. So really, and I know this wasn't necessarily connected to ELT, but it is in an educational environment. So for me, I think being representative shows the marginalized identities. And of course, it's not just LGBT plus identities. It's women, it's disabled people, it's race and ethnicity, it's age, it's all of those protected characteristics. If we don't represent these communities, people are going to feel invisible. They're going to feel, well, I know I did, I felt worthless. And if I saw myself, if I could see myself in materials, I would feel that maybe this is a safer space for me to be in. And I would feel like I wouldn't be alone. And so kind of reflecting on my work in the last couple of years, I don't want anybody to grow up not feeling safe or not feeling as if they belong, because that's kind of a false narrative at the moment. We do belong, we're all humans, and we deserve to be seen in materials and in classrooms.
Well, and teachers, for the most part, teachers are very concerned about the well-being of their students and about helping them to become everything that they can be. And, this from my perspective, this is just kind of self-evident, really, that this ought to be part of what we are doing as teachers. And then it's hard to do that as a teacher if it's not reflected in the materials that you're using, because then you like the materials that you're using.
Oh, of course, of course. And when I was teaching for 17 years. I never, it never really even occurred to me. So I was still in that heteronormative mindset. It never occurred to me that I didn't see anyone in the materials who was like me. And yet there I was still teaching the traditional white heteronormative family, whereas I knew that things were different. But yet it took me a very long time to realize that actually, yes, I can make a change and I can make a difference. But yeah, it took me a long time to actually figure that out.
Well, but for the same reasons that you said right at the beginning, you know, if you don't see it, then it kind of doesn't even occur to you that these things are possible, if you like. You know, so that's exactly, we've come kind of back in a loop, but that's exactly why it's so important, I think. I mean, my daughter's in last year of school at the moment, and certainly her experience and that of her brother has been much better than it was when I was at school, I think. But I think we've still got quite a long way to go, shall we say. And I think ELT is certainly probably behind like the UK school system. Yeah, so, you know, as you say, we've only just kind of scratched the surface really of why this is important. But let's talk a bit about, you know, what people can actually do as teachers, as material writers, as publishers. I don't know where you want to start on that little pyramid.
Goodness me, yes, it's rather a large pyramid, really, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to start off then with publishers, I think, because I think they're probably the ones that can enact the biggest change. Obviously, the kind of the elephant in the room is there are certain markets around the world that criminalize the LGBT plus identity. And I don't think that's going to change. I wouldn't necessarily expect, you know, ELT materials to change that. But, excuse me, what I think is that publishers maybe need to focus a bit more on the global majority where of countries that do not criminalize the LGBT plus community and focus on being more representative for those markets. I do realize that this may result in a little bit of questions around profit. But my question is really going to be, is it profit over identity or is it identity over profit?
Well,
I think that's something that publishers really need to think about. I think in kind of conversations I've had with people who work for publishers and also for freelance ELT writers, a lot of people don't really know how to approach incorporating LGBT plus identities into materials. And that hopefully is where I come in and I go, hi, hello, I can help you with that. It's not just me, but it's there. They need to get more diverse teams for not just the LGBT plus identity, but for all marginalized communities, so that everybody can be represented through lived experienced voices, to get kind of almost, I hate to say it, but almost expert advice on how somebody like me might want to be represented in materials. And I think publishers really just need to take a chance. I don't see it as a risk, personally. I mean, they may think differently, but I would say to take a chance. And even if they don't necessarily incorporate LGBT identities into a course book, maybe by having supplementary materials that are available on their website that incorporates LGBT identities would be a start. Because at the moment, from what I see, we aren't really represented at all. Although that is a little bit of a lie, because there are some representations of LGBT plus identities in, what should we say, in discussion course books or discussion resources, but these tend to be out of date. They tend to be offensive. They tend to be asking questions that actually don't discuss a person's ability. They actually discuss the existence of an LGBT plus identity.
Like
And
it's
that's
an issue.
yes. Kind of going back to my Aya Tefel talk, I am not a taboo. I am a person. I am a human being. I just maybe have different experiences to the heteronormative norm sort of thing.
I mean, I think this links very much, with changes that I see beginning to happen across ELT generally, and I say this as a, privileged, white, straight, middle class person who I think has typically, been the type of person who writes course books and British as well. All right. Or American if it's American, but native speaker. And, I think things are changing, and partly I think because of people like yourself who've kind of gone, hang on a minute, why are we doing it this way? Partly because, the world is changing. I mean, it used to be the case that in order to write a course book, you basically had to be able to either get to Oxford or London for meetings. But that's not the case anymore. So there's no need to have people who are based in the UK writing the materials because everything's done on Zoom anyway. So certain sort of practical things, I think, are opening things up. The world is opening up more, and we are learning more about each other. And, and in terms of materials, actually, the whole sort of paradigm of a course book that is sold to everybody is almost certainly, I think, going to change, or is changing.
Yeah.
Because people want things that are more tailored to their reality anyway. And so those excuses really of, well, we can't do this because we might offend somebody in one particular place, I think are going to hold less and less water.
Yeah.
In addition, to the obviously the moral aspects of it, as in excluding people. I mean,
definitely. And of course, I'm glad you kind of mentioned that, because I also have to acknowledge my privilege as well as a white, cis, kind of global north man, non-disabled. I do have that certain aspects of privilege that allow me to do this kind of thing. And I think something that needs to come into ELT, and also, well, not just ELT, but education in general, I think we need to be listening to the voices of the further intersectional identities that can, for example, I mean, there is, if we get LGBT identities into ELT coursebooks, there is the danger of it becoming a homonormativity, where it's kind of a cis white men, non-disabled, being represented, whereas of course there are a whole host of intersectional identities that also belong to the LGBT identity. And I think it's important for publishers to realize that that you can get the LGBT kind of lived experience from a vast range of intersectional identities. And I think it's really important for somebody like myself to acknowledge that as well. So yeah, that's why I do try to incorporate intersectional identities in whatever I do.
Well, ultimately, it is about reflecting the people who are going to be using the materials,
Mm.
you know, and I think that's, in terms of thinking about teachers, it's, as we said right at the beginning, it's about reflecting, you know, the people who are in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely, because everyone's voice is important. Everyone's voice deserves to be heard, and yet through discrimination, patriarchy, misogyny, etc., racism, ableism. Sorry, I'm just, you know, when you keep thinking about various things, yes. Through those kinds of discriminations, people's voices haven't been heard. And so I think it's up to the people in privilege, in certain aspects who have privilege, to listen to these marginalized identities. And I think it's just so important. And I think we'll get such if we did that, I'm just thinking, if we did that in ELT, how incredible would that be? Oh,
It's all
yeah.
about, I mean, we talked about this briefly at IATEFL, didn't we? But any kind of change like this, it's a snowball effect, is the sort of psychological term for it. You know, it
Yeah.
starts off small, but it gathers more and more snow kind of as it goes. And I think we are seeing the beginning of that, you know, which is a great thing, because I think it just makes it better for our students, ourselves,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
So thinking about teachers, then,
Mm.
you know, what can teachers be doing?
I think this is something that I would kind of call if I can say it correctly, visibilizing. There we go. Making people more visible. That's an easier way of saying it. Um, so doing making sure that months are seen and celebrated, not just, again, LGBT plus, but all the marginalized communities, because also this month it is Gypsy Roma Traveller History Month in the UK as well. And so, and of course there's Traveller Pride. So there are all sorts of things that intersect. I think by adapting certain materials, because as we know, the materials that exist at the moment from publishers are not that inclusive, but things are changing. By adapting, let's say, for example, there's a unit on the family. Quite often we would see in a family unit something about a heteronormative couple who are married and who have maybe 2 children and who are fairly middle class and who are not disabled. So potentially the teacher, of course, the onus would be on the teacher here, would be to find maybe images of different types of families, because you never know who you might have in your class. You don't necessarily know their background. And by incorporating different images of different types of families, it could be a solo parent, it could be a family with 2 women. And I do have to say here that I would not really call that a lesbian family. It's just a family, because
Yeah.
that's who they are. There might be an extended family. There might be a family with grandparents or one grandparent. There might be a couple with no children, still a family. And so by using these different images of families, you kind of expand the students' awareness and knowledge, and they might even recognize their own family within that. And so that's what I would suggest to teachers. Look for independently published materials that may incorporate these types of things. See what you can adapt from the textbook. See if you can even make your own, to be a little bit more representative.
It's about kind of questioning, I guess, isn't it? Like when you see things. I mean, actually, Carla asked a question about this, which is, you've kind of covered some of this already, but she says, instead of waiting for the publishers to change and be more inclusive, could be a long wait, we could adapt materials or create our own to be more inclusive and LGBTQIA plus friendly. And she says, what's your experience with this? And do you have any suggestions on this for ESL teachers and course designers? So you have just made, obviously, some suggestions, but there are, I mean, including yourself, but I'm also thinking about, and we'll talk about that in a second, but Reach Up, which is a Brazilian...
Raise Up.
Raise Up. Yes, sorry. Reach.
Yes.
Too many books called similar names. Yes, Raise Up, which I think is a Brazilian project, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you say a bit about like what you've come across and of course your own stuff as well?
So yeah, Raise Up, I think, are a very good kind of almost, well, not-for-profit collaboration. Started off by two people initially, I think, and then they've incorporated writers and editors in it. I think they've got, it's either 3 or 4 course books, and within each course book, the units are written by different writers, and they focus on different aspects of the protected characteristics or the kind of the topics that we wouldn't necessarily see in ELT course books. So maybe looking at refugees, maybe looking at LGBTQ identities, disability, questions and challenging racism, this sort of thing. And I think you can buy them from their website, and I think all of the money goes towards charities. So it's something that I really recommend having a look at. There are other kind of individual people making some inclusive materials. But of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about my own, really.
Absolutely, yes.
I know. So yeah, on my website, I've got a small collection now. I think it's growing, of inclusive resources. Initially, I started off wanting to represent everyone, and I realized that that's very difficult to do in one resource or one kind of lesson plan. And recently, my focus has been on representing different identities within the LGBTQIA plus community. And so I've got asexuality, I've got trans community in there, bisexuality. I want to not just focus on gay identity or gay and lesbian identity, because when we do talk about the LGBT plus community, there are so many people within it. And even sometimes within the community, these separate identities are often left kind of, they're often forgotten about. And so I wanted to ensure that I was as inclusive as possible within the constraints of the resources that I have, as well as trying to be intersectional as well. So incorporating age, disability, neurodiversity, though I need to do more with that, and race and ethnicity as well. So, and they can be bought, some are paid for, some are free, from my website, which I'll probably put in the comments afterwards, I think.
Yes, no, please do. And I will put it into, I will write a related newsletter about the topic, and I'll put it into there with some other useful links as well, like Raise Up. Susanna saying, when you talk to publishers now, do you feel things are shifting in terms of the moral obligation to do something about this when possible?
Yes. Yes. Yes, I think so. I think the recognition is there
Mm.
with publishers and packagers as well, that they should be doing, or that I think the urge is there, but
Mm.
I think the how to do it is what they're lacking.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why with your Flourishing Foundations course, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, I'm hoping to maybe produce some sort of training,
Mm.
possibly, that could be available for publishers and also writers, editors, and teachers.
Mm.
So that's in the pipeline.
I think that would be fabulous, because I do think often people's intentions are good, but they kind of don't want to put their foot in it or do the wrong thing, or, you know, so having that kind of guidance, if you like, and training, I think, you know, definitely is helpful.
I think.
Just okay, just time for one more question, I think. So, Lyubov, if I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but they say, I'm part of a reading group that's looking for a reading for this Pride Month. Do you have any recommendations? Ideally, a short story.
Mm.
Put you on the
Well, off
spot
the top of my head, I know off the top of my head, and I haven't read it myself, but I've seen people rave about it, and that's the Heartstopper
there.
series of books, which I think has now become a TV program.
Mm.
I'm not sure how long they might be, but also if you're looking for kind of, I'm a huge fan of Virginia Woolf, and I would certainly recommend the love letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, who weren't necessarily officially a couple because they were both married at the time to men,
Mm.
but they had what we would call a very close, intimate friendship. Of course, this was back in the 1920s, 1930s. So I would strongly suggest having a look at the love letters of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West.
Interesting. Yeah, Heartstopper. I think Heartstopper's graphic novels.
I think so, yes.
I've seen the TV series. My daughter's a big fan, so we watched
Mm.
it together.
Yeah, I haven't. I haven't. I should really, although just very busy all of the time.
Well, it's definitely feel good watching. If you need a bit of a lift, I would say I'd recommend it. Lovely. Okay, so yeah, we're coming up to the half hour. Thank you very much for talking to us. Yes, Susanna's saying your training idea sounds great. Having some specific and practical ideas to suggest myself when having this discussion with publishers would be so
Mm.
useful. See, I told you.
Oh yeah, and I love Carla's comment there as well about having students write their own idea of what family is to make it
Mm,
a more inclusive definition, which I think is fantastic.
mm. Yeah, and I mean, it's not quite in the same league, but I grew up in a single parent family in the 70s in a Catholic school where it was just
Mm.
unheard of really to have a divorced mother, so I kind of get a little bit of what it's like when it's not represented and it's not, the norm, and everybody's like about things, and it is important to have that. So,
Really is. Yeah.
mhm. Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter.